Okay, שבוע טוב, שנה טובה ומתוקה. We just began a new year, but this is the last shiur on this mini series of 4 shiurim about 4 teshuvot in the sense of 4 reactions by important Jewish rabbis to the challenges of modernity in the 18th and now the 19th century. If you remember, we spoke about the Baal Shem Tov, and who basically responded to the different challenges by focusing on the heart, by focusing on the spirit. We spoke about the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who his response was going back to the sources, going back to the Torah. We may maybe say focusing on the intellectual side. That's very superficial what I just said, but trying to be superficial. Then we would say that the Vilna Gaon went back or focused more on the intellectual side. Then on the last shiur, we spoke about Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who took the challenge of confronting modernity heads-on, Torah im derech eretz, looking at the way of the world and trying to implement Torah within or among the way of the world. And this week, we are going to speak about Rav Yehuda Alkalai, who stands out in this small group of 4 rabbis for a few reasons. One, and I think that should be said straight up in the beginning. I think that if I would have come to Rav Yehuda Alkalai and tell him, you know, you're going to be mentioned in the same group with the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon, he himself, I think, would feel uncomfortable in this group. And I'm not, and I spoke about it also when you spoke about Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Speaking about 4 responses does not mean that everyone is of the same stature in sense of halacha or halacha ruling or writing of Torah. These are different people with different areas of strength. Each one of them was an important rabbi and an important leader of the Jewish nation. The reason why I take them is because I think each one of them had shown and gave an example of a way to live Yahadut in the modern world in a very substantial and meaningful way, and not necessarily depending on their specific greatness in writing teshuvot on the Shulchan Aruch. I am not aware of Rav Yehuda Alkalai writing any response, for example. He may had. He was a Rav of a small Jewish city, as we would say later, for many years. So I'm sure that he answered, he gave psikot, and it's clear from his sefarim, he wrote many sefarim, it's clear from his sefarim that he was very knowledgeable, but it's a far cry from some of the other rabbis you spoke about. So it's just important to remember that. So that's first short introduction. The second short introduction, why he is standing out in this group of 4 rabbis, is that he is the only Sephardi rabbi. Now, I am not meaning to say, we can also say he's standing out because he has a blonde hair or I don't know what hair he has. I am mentioning here the question of him being a Sephardi, not because of it's so important what Eidah you are, but because it's very important to understand the background in which he is working or against which he is working. Because many of the challenges we spoke about in last shiurim, so we spoke about the new science, we spoke about Jews beginning to get emancipation, and how do you react to that? Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, much of his work was the question of how do you react to emancipation. And Rav Yehuda Alkalai was not part of this discussion. He was aware of it, he knew what is going on, he was in contact with rabbis from Western Europe, but he was not part of this challenge. The challenge that he was facing was very different, and to understand it, we have to understand what is going on in the place where he was born. So he was born in 1798. So I hardly can push him into the 18th century, right? So I'm saying, no, he's 18th century. Because he was born in 1788. But truth, obviously, that he is a figure of the 19th century and not of the 18th century. And he was born in Sarajevo, in what today is Bosnia. If you'd go a few decades ago, it was part of Yugoslavia. And if you'd go a few more decades ago, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you'd go a little earlier, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. So that is a place which is called the Balkan, which is very important to understand the history of Europe. It's in the edge of Europe, but it is extremely important. A famous example, you cannot understand why there was a war in World War I without understanding what is going on with the Balkan. Balkan, that's the right name, the Balkan. Yeah. So that's just obviously we speak here about the 18th century, so no First World War yet. But this is a place with very acute awareness of rising nationalism. And people there find themselves constantly fighting off foreign invaders. So they are always on the verge of rebelling, of finding themselves, debating their own identity. Are we part of, for example, are we part of Yugoslavia? That's a modern question. Or should we see every small nation there as their own thing? We had again later, it's after 1798 when he was born, but the whole rebellion of the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire that became very romanticized in European thought as part again of this spring of nations, of the rising of national identity, of the right for self-identification, right? If we, again, speaking in an anachronistic way. And he is born into all of that. Now, when he is born in Sarajevo, it is ruled by the Ottoman Empire. It is still ruled by the Ottoman Empire. But with this tsisa, how would you say tsisa? Bubbling of national identities, then one begins to think, what exactly is Yahadut? That's an old, for us, it's an old question. For them, it was somewhat of a new question. Now, the Jews in Western Europe, for the most part, they were like the Jews now in the United States. They don't want to speak about the question, is Judaism a religion or a nationality? Better not to speak about that. I just have your civil righs, and that's it. I practice whatever I want in my own home, and that's don't bother me. But that was in the United States. That was something that could be done, because in the United States, people came from all over Europe. And okay, so you can have this nationality or the other nationality, or they would call their maybe ethnicity. So we'd call Judaism ethnicity, and we'd give it a pass. But if you live, for example, in France or in Germany, then you say very, very clearly, I am of a German nationality, I am of a French nationality, it's only my religion which is Jewish. So I'm as French as any other of you. That is not going to work in a place like Eastern Europe or in a place like the Balkan. Religion and national identity are still too tight connected there to make such a separation. It's even today, it's very difficult, for example, to say, I am Polish by ethnicity or by nationality, but Jew by religion. I'm sure that there are a few people going around saying that, but it's very difficult. It's a very Catholic nation, extremely Catholic nation. So it's just very strange to say I am a Polish but with a Jewish religion. Now, in the Balkan back then, the Jews were beginning to ask themselves, what exactly are we? Are we a religion, or are we also a nation? And just as the Bosnians and the Serbs and others are claiming their national rights, so should we. Now, the Ottoman Empire basically gave a pretty good religious freedom. Now, there were always the occasional interruption and destruction, but basically there was religious freedom. But on the national basis, Jews were discriminated against. And again, not only or not even centrally because of the religion, but because they are not of the right nation. And they have to pay a special tax, and their biddings had to be of not of above a certain height, and they had sometimes to wear a special hat. And all of that, in the end, is helping to create this specific group identity of, again, what we call today in modern language, national identity. Now, I'm not going to enter into the discussion if we do not look from outside, but from within Judaism. So really, is Judaism a religion or a nation? I think that the distinction seems just not to hold in Jewish thought. We do not know to make this separation. I mean, if you are accepting upon yourself the Jewish religion, you are part of the Jewish people. It's the separation cannot be done. Although people would try, and obviously in the modern state of Israel, people would very hard try to do so. But if we look at our own sources, I think that's more or less that is clear. More or less that is clear. So the challenge the Jews there are facing is the question of who are we? And Rav Yehuda Alkalai is going to take this challenge and face it heads on and to produce something extremely interesting from this challenge. So as I said, he was born in Sarajevo in Bosnia in 1798. We know very little about his childhood. His father was also a rabbi, Rav Shlomo Chai, and he learned from him. He also learned from a very famous rabbi of the age, Rabbi Elazar Papo, who wrote a sefer that maybe some of you heard about, the Pele Yoetz, which is like an encyclopedia. It's going by the Aleph Bet, and you take some value or some entry and just write what is in his mind, the Torah, halacha, machshava has to say about it. An interesting sefer. So he learned also by him. It may be that he made Aliyah with his family in the age of 11. We are not sure. Be it as it may, in the age of 20, he is back in what we call today Yugoslavia, the big Yugoslavia. Okay. And he was given a smicha, ordination to rabbi, and in the age of 27, that is 1825, he becomes a darshan, and later would become the rabbi of a small town called Semlin, Zamelai. Again, because this place has so different nations, each one calls it slightly, or not so slightly, a different name. In the Jewish, usually the Jews called it Zemlin. Zemlin. So in Yiddish it is Zayin Ayin, Mem Lamed Yud Nun. Zemlin. Okay, fine. This city included about 100 Jewish families, which is not very small, but also not very big. So about 100 families, 60 of them Sephardi, and 40 of them Ashkenazi, because we speak about a place which is smack in the middle of the Ashkenazic land and Sephardic land. So he's becoming the rabbi there. At this time, the city is ruled by the Austro-Hungarian, I think back then it was only Austro, by the Austrian, by the Austrian Empire. It is after the time of, what is her name, Maria Theresa, right? So I think we spoke about her when we spoke about the Rav Yehuda. So Maria Theresa already left the scene, and now it was her son. I think it's not very important. It's the first Franz Josef. It's not the known one. The known one that we like and love is the second one. So I think it is the first Franz Josef. Be it as it may, it's really not very important. What is important is to understand that is the city, while it's not very big, it's very strategic, both in militarily between the Ottomans and the Europeans here the Austrians. More important to us, for the Jews, it sits in a very central location. People move from the Ottoman Empire into Europe, or from Europe into the Ottoman Empire, they pass through the city. And Rav Yehuda Alkalai, very young, 30 years old, he sits there and he gets all of this information and all of these new ideas from everywhere. And it's clear that he himself was a very creative person. And he thinks to himself always the question that we began with, meaning what would be with the Jews? He is also very close to Kabbalah. And out of his Kabbalistic learning, he comes to the conclusion that the year Taf Reish is 1840. The year 1840 is supposedly the year of the beginning of the redemption. That's what his calculation discovered to him. Now, he's not the only one who is reaching this conclusion. It is claimed that the Gra also came to the same conclusion. It's highly debated. It's highly debated, but there is such a claim, which may strengthen the thought that he made an aliyah. You remember the question, did he make an aliyah? And met with some of the Gra students that were already in Yerushalayim, and maybe received from them this idea that the year 1840 is supposedly the year of the beginning of the redemption. And now he sits there in Zemlin, and being the rabbi of the city, it seems was not enough to make a living. So he was also the rabbi of the local cheder. I'm not sure they called it the cheder, but elementary school. And he decides that he wants to teach the children Hebrew grammar, which is not a completely revolutionary idea. We met this will, to teach the children to speak Hebrew well, to understand what they read. We met it from time to time, especially from rabbis coming from Sephardic origins, because it seems that they were much more keen on understanding the language, while in Ashkenaz sometimes it's just an hefker, and hopefully it would be understandable. But in Sfard, in Sephardic lands, which for 300 years is not Sfard anymore, it's not Spain, but in the Ottoman Empire, Hebrew grammar was considered much more important. So he wants to teach them Hebrew grammar, but he doesn't have a textbook. So what does he do? He writes a textbook for Hebrew grammar. Now he writes it in Ladino, because that is the language the children can speak and read in. So he writes it in Ladino. The grammar itself is, you would excuse me, is not part of my point of interest here. But he writes also an introduction. And the introduction, he explains how important is it to learn Hebrew. And why is it important? Because it's important to, I would say it in my own language, it is important to preserve our national identity. And he says it's extremely important to preserve it now. Why? Because we are nearing the year of 1840, of Taf Reish, that's the Hebrew, Taf Reish. And that is the year of redemption. So if you look at the first source, so the book is named Darkei Noam, and he publishes it in the year 1839. So, you know, they say that if you want to give a date for redemption, take some space after the date you are supposed not to be in the world anymore. And then you are safe. But he is very, obviously, he's very assured. So he writes in 1839, he quotes Yaakov Avinu, En ze ki im beit, it's from Parshat Vayetze. En ze ki im beit Elokim veze sha'ar השמים. So ze, en ze, ki im beit Elokim. Veze. So if you take the ze veze, it's the Gmatrיא is 30. You can check it later at home, but it's 30. Now you join sha'ar, because ze sha'ar. Ze veze sha'ar, it's 430. Excuse me, it's 400. It's 600. It's 600. 600 is Taf Reish. So the sha'ar, the gate, is the year Taf Reish. רמז לנו אבינו הקדוש, שבשנת תר' נעזר על ידי תורה ותפילה וצדקה, ונפתח פתח כחודה של מחט, והוא בערבונו ובתפילתו יעזור, ויפתח לנו שערי רחמים. So we only need to open as the needle, and God would open the gates of the flood, right? And גאולה would come. And he says, וגם כן שער 50, that's the 40, we have the 49 gates, מ"ט שערים of tahara, of purity, but we cannot reach the 51 without help from the divine. וגם אותיות רעש, גמטריא צפת. So שער is also רעש, if you change the location of the letters. And it's also in Gematria Tzfat. Why is it important? Because in 1837, there was a catastrophic Ra'ash Adama, meaning that is an earthquake in Tzfat, which completely destroyed. What is called today the old city is not very old, because the real old city of Tzfat was almost completely destroyed and devastated. Many Jews died, many fled the city because it was a few earthquakes one after the other. So they were just afraid to come back. And it's almost destroyed the Jewish settlement in Tzfat. So he says, you see, it's shar, it's rash. Now that it's happening, it means that Geula, redemption, is close. And then he says, וכן גם דברי חז"ל, אם תבוא שנה ראויה לגאולה. So he says, in the words of Chazal, we find that if the time of redemption would come, and Am Yisrael would not repent, נהפכת לשנה רעה. He says, it is not promised that the year would become a year of redemption. It depends. It can be, it's an year with potential. It can become a year of redemption. It can become a year, chas v'chalila, of destruction. And he continues, I think I'll close it. Now, have an interesting question. So, okay, it's the year of redemption. What should we do? So you begin to say, you know, tefillot, we are not really up to daven bechavana, as they used to be davening. And anyway, if for 1,800 years they were not able by tefillah to bring the geula, obviously it is not enough. And then he say, maybe ta'aniyot, maybe we would fast. Said, no, we are much weaker than earlier generations. We would not be able to fast as they did. And if they were not able to bring the Geula with their fast, then we also not. Maybe Torah. No, if the earlier generations, which were greats of Torah, and nonetheless Geula didn't come, then we have no chance. So what should we do? He says, you know what we can do that they couldn't? Now the Ottoman Empire rules on so much swaths of land. There are no borders. What we can do, the opening like a needle, which is easy. Everyone, you don't need to be fair, not to be a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, not the righteous man that can daven. The only thing you need to have is legs. Walk to Yerushalayim. So that is a revolutionary idea. And that is why is considered by many, I think justifully, as a forerunner of Zionism. Because what he suggested is we all should make aliyah and prepare ourselves for the redemption that would come in the year of Tafresh. So he published the book, and he is met with scorn from all sides. Because he is a young rabbi sitting in a not very important city, and he is beginning to write things about Geula, and next year is Geula, so we should all go to Yerushalayim. And, you know, for many, it rings the bell of Shabtai Tzvi. Who are you to speak about Geula and give us Gimatriot? You take responsibility for all the masses that would now go to Yerushalayim? Who would supply them there? So he's attacked from left and from right. From left, the reformers are already beginning to work, and with Avraham Geiger is already working. Rav Yehuda Alkalai is younger than Geiger. And they publish again, they say, what are you doing? We are not of the national, we are not a nation. We are not interested in going back to our ancient old homeland. We are uprooting from our Siddur all mentions of Yerushalayim, of Beit HaMikdash, of Zion. What you are doing there is damaging our attempt to show and to prove to the Goyim that we are really part of them. So the left, we may say, are very unhappy with his words, but also from the right. Because as I said, who are you to claim that there will be redemption next year? And even more important, what we would call today, and you'd excuse me for the crude language, but the ultra-Orthodox, right? The Yishuv Vayashan in Yerushalayim, they were not interested in people that would come and are not able to learn. Because what these people would do in Eretz Israel, in the Holy Land? They would walk. We are not interested in Eretz Israel in people who walk. In Eretz Israel, you come in order to learn Torah, and you are being provided by the Jews in Chutz La'aretz. That is the right order of things. For years, you were not allowed to live in Yerushalayim if you have walked, because it's only a place for holy things. Now, for us, it's a very different mindset. But that was, at least in some communities, it was clear that that's how things should be. And he was attacked very, very, very viciously, to the extent that in 1840, he writes a defense of his introduction to his grammar book. Now, the grammar is completely forgotten now. He is now defending his position that, redemption is going to come, and it's the year 1840. And he says there the following, I'm in source ב' למען תנוח דעתך אחי, אומר לך שדברי הזוהר הקדוש ובייחוד מה שכתבתי בהקדמה על חשבון תפ"ר, he says what I wrote in the introduction to my first book about the year תפ"ר, וכפי שתראה להלן, לא נאמרה על שנה זו בלבד, כי אינו עניין ליום אחד. He says, don't worry, I'm not speaking about something extremely dramatic with 1 million Jews now moving to Yerushalayim. It's completely the other way. I am very rationalistic in my approach, very practical. I am thinking about how can we really move Jews in a safe and sound and feasible way from everywhere, Europe and North Africa, back to Eretz Israel in a way that they would be able to provide themselves. So I'm not speaking only about the year 1840. Now he writes something that is amazing. He says, הואיל ותפ"ר נקראות 100 שנה, מן היום ועד שנת תפ"ר צדקת. Says there are 100 years of תפ"ר. תפ"ר, תפ"א, תפ"ב, it's all תפ"ר. Now he says we have an opening, we have a window for redemption. The window for redemption is from 1840 to תפ"ר צדקת, which is 1939. That's, I think that's scary almost. So he writes that in 1840. We have, the window is open from 1840 to 1939. And if we would not act in this window, he says, there would come the year Tafshin, Chas v'Shalom, which is 1940. And he says, people that would not come to Israel in this window of time, then הקדוש ברוך הוא would force them to come. And this, he says that would be by an evil king. Yeah, that's wow, right?
Wow.
That's right.
100 years from 1801 to,
1840 to 1939. The Hebrew dates, תפ"ר to תפשין. Yeah, תפ"ר to תפשין. So it will be 1840 to 1839 is the last year. We can almost say 1 of September, right? 1839. That's the last date. Yeah. So that's amazing. Now again, we read the Gmatiot earlier. I'm sure that all of us were okay. So you have a nice Gmatiot of the pasuk of Sha'ar השמים. But when he writes that, you have to, I think, to take the head down. And he says, "Kol sarfei mala yereim veroadim u'meyach." He says, even the angels are shaking because the question of the fate of the Jewish nation is now on the scales. If they would make aliyah, ואם חס ושלום אין ישראל חשים בכך, but if חס ושלום עם ישראל would not take the chance, while it's open, the gates are now open, if they would not do so, נהפכת לעת צרה. Then it would be reversed, it would be turned into a time of trouble. Okay, so that's, now we can also understand, he's going to act with a very strong urgency. He feels that there is a window that is being opened, and people are not, everyone sits where he sits, and no one seems to do anything. And he is going to write, I think about 20 or 30, I have 2 thick volumes of all of his writings that were collected. And I think it's about 20 or 30 books, separate books. They later collected it, but 20 or 30 separate books, almost always returning this on the same basic idea, trying to convince people. He would travel, make journeys through Europe, through Eretz Israel, trying to convince people that they must make aliyah, because who knows what would happen if they would not. And planning. We would speak about a few things that he planned. None of them he was able to realize. Not for lack of trying, but because there was no cooperation. Let's see. In 1843, he writes a book, which is this big programmatic book, we may say, which is called Minchat Yehuda. Now, what did happen in 1840? It's very difficult to say that any beginning of redemption happened. There were a few Jews that made aliyah, but there were a few Jews who made aliyah before and after. What did happen in 1840 was the Damascus affair, Alilat Damasek. The Damascus affair is something that we can easily make a whole shiur about. I would have to summarize very, very shortly. It was the medieval, the most dark ages were suddenly knocking on the window of the modern world. And while people were feeling, so we are in 1840, in the 19th century, and we have already liberalism going on in Europe, and Jews are being considered, it's not in the more, at least by the more progressive circles, it is considered uncivil to be against Jews, or at least to say that you are against Jews. And suddenly, in Syria, in Damascus, there is a blood libel. And the Jews are being blamed that they kidnapped a Christian Nazir, monk. Yeah, and he had a helper. So the Jews are accused of kidnapping him and murdering him and using his blood for the baking of matzah. And it was not exactly the Ottomans that were ruling back then in Damascus. There was some local pecha that made a rebellion against the Ottomans, that he was independent. And what he did was the way that you investigate such things. How do you investigate such things? You kidnap some Jews and you begin to torture them, and you see what would go out. It's very, very harsh. I don't want even to go into the details. If you just Google, everything now is public knowledge. And suffice to say that when they were not able to break the local rabbi into admitting that they used the blood of this Christian monk, what they did was to kidnap all of the children in the local Jewish schools, that is 63 children, from the age of 4 to the age of 10, and they tortured them to the eyes of their parents in order to make the parents confess. That worked. Anyway, that worked. And few of the Jews confessed to something that obviously was completely fabricated. And a few died. Few of those being tortured died. Few of those were convicted. But the whole Jewish world was reeling. And Moshe Montefiore from England began to become involved. And there were some Jews in Western Europe that already held some influence because they were big bankers, as Moshe Montefiore, and they were able to influence their local governments to interfere for the sake of the Jews that were accused in in things that were completely just out of the ordinary world. And in the end, it worked in the sense that they were able to release those that survived the torture. So the Jewish community was devastated, and there were also pogroms, because after the confessions, it was allowed for the non-Jews to take revenge. So the Jewish community in Damascus was devastated. But leaving that aside, it's as I said, it's a story which is worth telling by itself. For us, what is important is that suddenly the Jewish people rediscover themselves as one nation. For hundreds of years, if there would be an explosion in Spain, the Jew in Ashkenaz would obviously feel empathy towards his fellow Jew, but there was nothing really that he could do, or that he even thought that he would do. And suddenly the nation, because of advances in technology, because of advances in transportation, and because of the different mindset of a nation, the Jewish nation suddenly re-emerged as one entity. It was like a small Tchiyat HaMetim. But Rav Yehuda Alkalai, who was looking for signs, right? Because it's 1840, something should happen. He saw that. And he said, yes, that is true. That is true. The Gemara says that, how do you know? The Gemara says, if you have someone that was born with two heads, should he put one pair of tefillin on one of his heads, or two pairs of tefillin? So the Gemara says, you take hot water and you pour on one head. If the second head screams, you know it's one person, and then they should put only one pair of tefillin. If it doesn't scream, then you know it's two people. Now, this obviously the Gemara, I hope that it's understood. The Gemara doesn't speak about two persons who was born with two heads and you pour hot water on his head. What the Gemara there is trying to say is that, how do you know that if the Jewish nation, which is separated, speak in different languages, live in different cultures, how do you know it's one? If one Jew is tortured somewhere and the other in the other side of the world schemes, then you know it's one nation. If he doesn't care, you know that they were separated. And Rav Yehuda Alkalai says, you can see that we are one nation. Now that we are one nation, let's work together. Let's work together. And he began to write this programmatic book, which he would publish in 1843. And there he says, here in the first paragraph, he says, I don't have time. I'll just say it by Baal Peh, and you would read later. He says, anyone who says that we need to wait in Chutz La'aretz till Mashiach would come and take us back to Eretz Israel, says he is mechalel shem shamayim. He is desecrating the name of God. Very sharp, very sharp. So he was punched, and he's not holding back his own punches. He says, it is true that Beit HaMikdash should come from heaven. But that is the second stage of the process. That is when God returns to us. But Shuvu elai v'shuvu aleichem. God says to us, you should first come to me, and then I will come to you. Now, what does it mean to come? What is tshuva? And there he says something which is very profound. He says, tshuva, if we speak about individuals, then tshuva is spiritual. You are returning to God. But when you speak about a nation, how can a nation do tshuva? He says, a nation can do tshuva by returning to the land of God. That is the meaning of tshuva. When in Parashat Nitzavim we say, Veshavta, Hashem says to us, Veshavta ad Hashem Elokecha. What does it mean? You should go back to God. It means go back to Eretz Israel. That's what you should do. You make tshuva, return with your legs, with your feet, when you return to Eretz Israel. And he says, anyone who says otherwise, his words are nullified, are completely cancelled. I'm not interested in them. והדבר הגדול הזה צריך בקשה מאת מלכי הארץ. And he says, now in order to do so, as I said, he wants to be realistic, he wants to be pragmatic. So he says, obviously we cannot just all stand up and begin to go to Eretz Israel. The Ottomans would stop that. We need to speak with the lords of the land. Now, the Ottomans. in order to speak with them, we need the rich people of the Jewish nation making some type of a council and working as one unit in order to facilitate this return. So and then he says, צריך לעשות את זה, we need to do so כדרך חוכמת הפוליטיק. We need to do it by politics. Yeah, we cannot just wait. We need to take our hands and put them into the mud of national politics and of real politics and international politics and begin to speak with the Ottoman ruler, Sultan, and speak with the Austrian emperor, and speak with everyone that is willing to speak with you. Now, those of you that are familiar with the activities of Benjamin Ze'ev Theodor Herzl know that that's exactly what he did. So Rav Yehuda Alkalai was shouting that that's need to be done, but I'm not sure why he couldn't, maybe he didn't have the charisma. He couldn't really take after him people and cause them to follow his program. But he was shouting what we should do. That's the best that he could have done.
Simply because rabbis shouting to people could be different.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, you're right. You're right. And then he has an interesting idea. He says, you know what? If you cannot all leave, let's do it that way. Every family would send one child to Eretz Israel. And that way, he says, we on one hand would have a nice beginning of a Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel. Also, we would have a good connection between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Israel. There is a good chance that the people after the parents would also make Aliyah. Right? So that's he's always trying to think in what can work. What can work? How can I? So people oppose. So what can I suggest that maybe they will accept? He says there is no other way. We must go back. And he says, but we also must return to speak Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh. He says otherwise it won't work. If we would continue to speak Ladino, and the Jews from Europe would continue to speak Yiddish, and the Jews from Baghdad would continue to speak Arabic, that would not go to anywhere. If we want to be one nation, we must revive the Jewish language, which is not Yiddish, and not Ladino, and not Arabic. It is Ivrit. It is Sfat HaKodesh. But he says we should never get... Now, he couldn't dream that it would be so fast that the Jewish language should be revived. He spoke about a long process. Again, he tried to think how it can be done. But again, it's amazing. It's amazing because he's trying to think, and you see that he's not a prophet. He's not claiming to be a prophet. But when you think on the right way, it seems that you are right in many of your guesses. He says we need to teach everyone. He says, no, it's very important. He says not only the boys, teach also the girls. Because they would teach usually Ivrit only to boys as part of their Limudei Kodesh. And the Banot would hardly know how to read from a Siddur and not understand what they say. And he says, no, if we want to make it into a living language, you must teach it to girls as well. Because the men and women should speak with each other in this language. Now, again, you can imagine other rabbis in his time that it's aberration. You take the Lashon HaKodesh and you want to make it into something of a secular, of a chol. We use Lashon HaKodesh when we learn Gemara, and we use the vernacular when we speak about matters of secular things. It makes sense. It makes sense. Lehavdil, by Catholics, right? They speak in Latin while they do the sacraments, and they speak in whatever language they speak when they speak about secular things. So that makes sense. There is the religious sphere and the secular sphere. And Rav Yehuda Alkalai, no, that's not right. He says that is not right because we are a Jewish nation, not only a Jewish religion. So we should speak Lashon HaKodesh also on our secular activities. The years go by. In 1852, he published another sefer called Mevasser Tov, in which he says we need to make an organization. He doesn't call it that way, a Jewish agency that people, and he expands, people would vote from all areas of Jewish diaspora, and they would send the missionaries, and there would be a seifa, he called it, a seifa. A seifa is a government. Basically it's the seifa, le'esof, gathering. Yeah, but it's a government. It speaks about a functioning government of the Jewish people that would be empowered to take decisions that impact the Jewish nation. Now, that is an idea that no one even thought about for 2,000 years, right? We have great rabbis, great rabbis, but did Rabbeinu Tam thought maybe I should make contact with a rabbi in Spain, and then we'd make contact with a rabbi in Bavel, and we would make some committee that would decide? I mean, that was something that was so much beyond. It's not even that they oppose it. It was not something they were thinking in these lines, because they were, I don't know, because it was not on the radar even. They were on survival mode, and that was it. The most that they could done in Poland, they had what is called the Vad Arba Aratzot, this committee of 4 lands. So that included most of Eastern Europe, and it had the ability to make some governing takanot and decide things for the local communities, but it was very loose, and local communities many times were able to not accept the takanot that were done by the Vad Arba Aratzot. So what, again, he is having extremely new ideas. Now, how much of them he was getting from his Torah and Kabbalah, how much he was getting from looking around and seeing the nations that are the new nation rising and making governments, and I don't know. I don't think it's very important. Now, again in 1852, he writes not a book, a small pamphlet, 18 pages, against the reformers, because he's very angry with them, and it's very interesting. He's angry with them about their attempts to change halacha. He's very, very religious, he's very orthodox. But he says the Rabbanim are trying to fight them on the religious ground. He says they would lose. Because the disease does not begin from religion. The disease begins from their desperation from redemption. And that's why they want to join the French or the Germans. If you would give them a hope to go back to their land, they wouldn't need any reform. So it's very interesting. He says that's the right way to fight it. Not to publish answers that you are allowed to put an organ in the shul or not allowed to put an organ in the shul. The whole idea to put an organ in the shul begins when you lose your own identity, your own backbone, and you begin to look around for ideas from other religions. But if you tell them, we want to be Jews because being Jews is an important thing, and we can have our own homeland, and we should go there, and we should have our own identity, our own culture, then they would stop looking around. They would have self-definition. So I think it's a very interesting approach to the question of reform. Again, I continue. You see, he is returning the same basic theme. Again, he's hoping that somewhere it would enter. In 1870, so that's 8 years before his ptira. In 1870, he is writing another pamphlet. It's called Menachem Tzion. Now, there begin to come people to Eretz Israel, but they are not very religious. So people say to him, how do you encourage people not religious to come to the Holy Land? Look what he says. That we read inside. It's short. Source Vav. He says, Ishuv haaretz, settling the land, ubeit hacholim hagadol hakolel. So it's like a huge hospital, he says, Eretz Israel. And that would give medicine, ויעלה ארוחה ומרפא, לכל תחלואי בית ישראל, to all of the Jewish diseases. חולי אהבת השם, ואהבת התורה, ואהבת האחווה, ואהבת ארץ קברות אבותינו. כמו שכתוב, אם תמצאו את דודי, מה תגידו לו שחולת אהבה אני, ישוב הארץ וירפא את חולי הרוח מחלת הכפירה. It says, you are wrong if you think that you would fix the disease in חוץ לארץ, and then people would make aliyah. No, if they would stay there, there is the source to the disease. They would perish. If you want to have a chance in fixing the disease, in healing it, you need to first bring them to Eretz Israel. Then you'd have time to walk. Now we can see that he was obviously completely right, because people that would stay there would assimilate. You first need to bring them here, and then you have time to walk. Because even if one generation does not come back, but at least their children are still in the fold, they identify as Jews, they are much more accessible. But people that stay there and are off the derech, it's one-way ticket. It's almost immediately out. So this is, again, a very interesting, maybe a little too much optimistic, if you thought that it would immediately, it's like a huge hospital that would solve everything. Okay, so it takes more like asylum, I guess, than a hospital. but it's getting close. It's getting close. It's getting close. But he was niftar in 1878. That's before Hesed began his activities. But we speak about there is a connection between them, which I would like to speak about. At least a speculation about the connection. He was extremely annoyed when there was a society called Kol Israel Chavirim, Kiach. That was an alliance, a French alliance of Jews that they were trying to take care of all the Jews in the world. It's idealistic people, but they were not very religious. So part of their ideas was to take people that were harassed and Jews that were persecuted in different places and send them to North America, which is a nice place, growing place. Why not? And safe, no anti-Semitism there, at least they thought. So let's send them to America. He was extremely annoyed with that. He was writing letters all the time. Don't send them to America, send them to Eretz Israel. You already they already left their home, so they are already on transportation. Just take them to Eretz Israel. He was very frustrated by not being able to convince people to his ideas. It's very sad because as you read his later books, he still is burning. You see that he's burning with conviction and with urgency. But he's becoming more and more bitter for not winning the hearts of the people, of the rabbis, of the leadership, of the masses. And in Source Chet, that is from 1865, so I'm now a little back in time. He says, Zeli 25 shana, asher בערה בי ארץ חמדה, שחמדו לאבותינו הקדושים, ואני קורא בחיל על ישובה. He says, for the last 25 years, I am burning with the desire for the land of our forefathers, that our forefathers were willing to go to. And I am strongly calling people to settle the land. ואף כי שמעתי אומרים כי יש חכמים שאין רוחם. Now people say to me that some of the sages are not happy with coming back and settling the land. אנוכי אחור לא נסוגותי. He says, I would not step down. כי אמרתי תיכתב זאת לדור אחרון, ואם לא יעשה השכל, יעשה הזמן. That's a sentence, right? אם לא יעשה השכל, יעשה הזמן. If you would not understand it by good, by mind, then time would force you to accept that I'm right. Now that's a bitter sentence. מה שלא יעשה השכל, יעשה הזמן. I don't think that even he predicted that it would be so horrendous. I think that what he thought was something like the Gerus Farad. So I mean, now that's very terrible by itself. I don't think he was able to, no one was able to predict the Holocaust. I mean, that's something that was beyond the imagination of anyone. But he knew that something bad is going, that's clear, it is writing it again and again, something very bad is going to happen. And you see, he writes, if I'm not able to convince you by mind, then you know, you'd learn in the hard way. What can I do? He himself made Aliyah in 1874. 1874. I mean, that's basically, again, it's very ambiguous because on one hand, he's realizing his dream, right? He's making Aliyah, but he does it only after he completely raised his hands from being able to drag people. The reason why he stayed was because he hoped that he would be able to convince more people to make Aliyah. And when he is completely desperate of succeeding in that, then he's himself is making Aliyah alone with his wife Esther, and he dies 4 years later in Dalet Tishrei, which is not only a few days ago. Dalet Tishrei, Tafresh Lametet, 1878. Now, 1878 is already the founding of Petach Tikva. So things are beginning to move. By the way, Petach Tikva was established by some of his students. Malabes, which how it was called back then. You can see it in source tet. זמן קצר לאחר מותו, קנו 5 אנשים ירושלמים מחסידיו הנגררים אחריו את הכפר אמלבס. המלבס. שטח של 400 מעניות אדמה, הנמצא מהלך 2 קילומטרים מיפו, והעמידו בו על הקרקע 50 משפחות יהודיות. So his students, 5 of his students from ירושלים, bought the land that later became פתח תקווה. So something had moved, not near to what he hoped, but something had moved. Now, it's very interesting that so many of the principles and ideas he's speaking about were later repeated by Herzl. So some historians were not able to withhold the temptation to try and find connections between these two people. Now, the father of Herzl was a student in Zemlin, in the school of Rav Alkalai. Now, again, being in the school of someone, we should be very careful with pointing out direct influence. But somewhat, something may have passed. So, as I said, they found many trivial details. The grandfather of Herzl was the Baal Tokea in the shul of Rav Alkalai. Now, again, maybe in some drasha, but who knows? Who knows? Obviously, he spoke about it all the time. I think that is clear. So, in some of the drashot, he spoke about going to Eretz Israel, and it entered the heart of the family. And you know, it was in the air. It was in the air. So, again, he's a forerunner. He's considered as a mevaser, a forerunner of Zionism. And historical evaluation is difficult. It's difficult. To what extent he was successful, to what extent he was a prophet that was not heard. But we, as we are trying to ask ourselves what we can learn from him, I think this idea of Teshuva is a general concept of Teshuva, is a national concept of Teshuva, of returning to the land of God and coming closer to God by living in the place of our forefathers, Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. I think that is something that we can obviously learn and hold to. And by that we finish this series. And Imir Hashem, after Sukkot, the week after Sukkot, Be'ezrat Hashem would continue, would return to the 18th century because there are a few very important rabbis that we skipped.
I appreciate all the people here that made Teshuva.
That is right. That is very much right. Thank you, Pnina. תודה רבה. גמר חתימה טובה.
Thanks, Rav.
As it's said, what we have.